Next, your speaker order, please.
I'm Carol Chen. I'm the first speaker and also doing the reply speech. Prefer gender pronounce she or her.
Thank you.
I'm Weihang Wong. I'm the second speaker. My preferred gender pronounce is she or her.
Beihang, right?
Well, I'm the third speaker. I'm Sui Shen Qian. I'm preferred gender pronounce she and her.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the EFL finals of Australs Weight Championship. Woo! On affirmative, we have IUTETT, and on negative, we have Beihang CCL. My name is Sally, and I'll be your chair for this round. I'll have my panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Fraser.
Matt.
Lily. Jade.
Kevin.
Bennett.
Thank you. Debating on the motion that we prefer a world where the Mottainai mentality is dominant, we'd like to invite the first affirmative speaker to open this debate. Here.
Oh wait, I think the mic is really long press.
Not sure.
Am I audible? Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think there are two important metrics in this debate. The word that translates these changes into corporations, and secondly, in which side internalized habits are better changed in the very first place. Before moving on to this, few important setups. So what does the Mottainai mentality or dominant mentality looks like in the very first place? I think when some mentality is dominant, it means you internalize it more, you talk about it more. This probably translates into your day-to-day life habits, right? The way you think about something, the way you talk about something, you think about something. Something, for example, capitalism is deeply rooted in our system. So we could say that in present status quo, capitalism is a dominant mentality and it is reflected in our internal systems and whatnot in the very first place. But also it's important to clarify we are not actually against capitalism in the very first place. I think as Mottainai mentality, as a dominant mentality, what it will essentially do, it will keep the capitalism in a check and balance system. People now question much more in the very first place, and it will probably change how we interact with capitalism in the very first place. Now, the first constructive as to how this changes translates into corporation being changed in the very first place. What is the premise of the argument in the very first place? Recognize the fact that currently in the present status quo, there are companies that are exploiting they're exploiting in the environment in a very bad way. How does it look like? They're probably like building clothes that are extremely cheap and not sustainable in the very first place. And since these products are extremely cheap, so most people are likely to buy these products. But these products, like most people buy this product because these are cheap and not because they want it in the very first place. And as a result, this translates into products being wasted in the very first place. We have seen instances of companies like Gap, Zara doing it in the very first place. So this was the premise of this argument. So now, what happens in our side of the world? the point in time you come up and set Mottainai mentality as the dominant mentality, I think few important changes happen in the wafer space. So what does it look like? First of all, in cases of consumer in the wafer space. So now these consumers talk about it and try to internalize the fact. Now since it is a dominant mentality, you see others being extremely mindful about spending. You see government mandating policies regarding this. You personally now feel much more guilty when you spend something which is not sustainable in the wafer space. So how does that translate into corporations being changed in the wafer space? I think it categorizes into 3 ways. First of all, the internal management within the Zara. Secondly, the people being much more scrutinized. And thirdly, in terms of policy being set by the government in the wafer space. So in their side of the world, in the present status quo, Zara, trying to cover up this hyper-capitalism, is probably trying to run some campaigns like green theme mentality and whatnot in the wafer space. But these are not effective because people have not internalized it. Zara would probably come up and run a campaign, or any other company would come up and run a campaign, but even if they don't do it properly, people won't call it out. But in our side of the world, firstly, they can't get away with this. So in our side of the world, people will be much more investigative about it. Now, since it is a dominant mentality, there will be probably a set of people who will have much more discourse about it within the social media. We'll talk about it, we'll give posts regarding different forums as to how, even though they are trying to preach this thing, they are not internalizing doing it. So in other words, there will be much more scrutiny and accountability within the system of Zara in the wafer space. But we also tell you how it changes the system within the internal management of Zara and within the employees in the wafer space. Now, since Mottainai mentality is the dominant mentality, and you talk about it more and you are now much aware about it more, Zara as an entity will be much more careful because they also realize how people are much more aware about it, how people will probably hold them much more accountable regarding this, how people will probably scrutinize them in the wafer space. But secondly, they also realize that there are going to be much more competitors. Now, since people are preferring sustainable options, people are caring for environmental options, the companies that are probably will come up with these options will be much more likely to gain traction by the customer. So companies like Zara and Gap will realize this thing and will try to ensure that they also bring actual sustainable products to go against this competition in the wafer space. But thirdly, we tell you to also get reflected in government, in the policy making of government and voter banks. It's extremely intuitive that now, since people are talking about it, it's much more likely people within the government and policy makers will talk about it and try to regulate and mandate policies that protect these things, and it will probably also reflected in the voter bank as well in the wafer space. So what is the exclusive impacting of this argument from our side of the world? So since current status quo, in the current status quo, there is already awareness about this, but this is not still effective. I think in our side of the world, it's extremely and the only possible way where you could set this as a dominant mentality and directly clash with hyper-capitalism in the wafer space. So unless and until it is a dominant mentality, it's very less likely that it can go against hyper-capitalism in the wafer space. So that's why we take the point of environment in our side. But secondly, we'll tell you as to how we also change people's normal habits in the wafer space. So what is the premise of this argument and what does the picture look like? Now you probably need 1 or 2 pants, but you go to the shopping and you see a cheap and unsustainable product and you like it, you probably take that 3rd or 4th pant as well, even though you don't need it. It will probably rest in your cupboard in the wafer space. But secondly, it also looks like in cases of how you spend your time in the wafer space. You're probably not mindful about how you spend your time. You have exams tomorrow, you probably spend your time 2-3 hours scrolling away through social media in the wafer space. But in their side of the world, since it is not a dominant mentality and you, after just wasting that period of time, you probably feel a bit guilty, but you still do that anyways and go on with your life. But in our side of the world, because of the picture painting we gave you, and as to how it has become a dominant mentality, it's much more likely you will feel much more guilty and have a much more probabilistic, more urge to change this thing in the wafer space. So, how does that materialize in their side of the world, in our side of the world? So, firstly, everyone in the present status quo wants to improve their wealth and wants to get ahead in life. But in their side of the world, people cannot do this because of their own reasons in the wafer space. What are the reasons in the wafer space? So for example, they don't have someone they might have free choices to do something. They might have the free choices to like play a game in the very first place. But at the end of the day, they're still becoming guilty in the very first place because there is no form of accountability or guidelines in their side of the world. Moreover, instances like social media and whatnot that have exclusive algorithms to dictate your social media actions tell you that these are choices that you make are probably coerced and manufactured in the very first place. But in their side of the world, after you all do this, you still justify these actions by saying, this is my free choice, I can do what I want. But at the end of the day, you still feel extremely guilty, you still feel extremely bad because of not doing the things you wanted to do in life and you wanted to achieve in your life in the very first place. But now in our side of the world, you don't justify this habit. Your decision-making calculus changes, and you are now much more mindful about what you're doing. We are not saying that you'll probably absolutely stop procrastinating, but just be much more mindful. You'll probably see your friends not watching Netflix before your exams day in the very first place. So I think it has two extremely important impacts. Impact number one, now you are much more minimalistic about this, and so you spend less, you feel less guilty, but secondly, you become much more efficient as well. Now you probably do your work in a better way, in an efficient way, because you're saving time and resources, but you're using this time to probably rest and not get involved in the hustle culture. You're becoming much more efficient, you're taking much more rest. That's why, based on that, very proud to be affirmative.
Thank you for that speech. First next, please. Here.
Am I audible?
Three rebuttal government side. Number one, they assume that corporations and capitalisms are bad. They assert that they won't do anything good but exploitation on their side of the house, which I will explain later in our cases why we have an overall better economy with more and more people having the desire to buy things and stuff like that. And secondly, they tell us that on their side of the house, they're going to have check and balance against corporations because they're doing bad things. But the key thing here is that on their side of the house, people seldom buy new things, and they don't really care about different kinds of goods and how they product these kind of things because they don't have that sort of interactions when they're actually buying goods. They don't see that kinds of advertisement and campaign, meaning that the discussion of those kind of things will be much less on their side of the house. So a lot of their cases about more regulation, more policy being made is actually falls on their side of the house. While on our side of the house, we get more exposure. We have more things like people discussing how Zara is setting up the factories in Vietnam and how Apple is doing some kinds of pollutions actually, which means that on our side of the house, we can actually fulfill the burden like they claim. And thirdly, because of they tell us that because of their own reasons, when people entertain, they will feel guilty on their side of the house. They just give us no explanation of why this impact actually matters. They tell us that there will be more efficient, which is not actually true. Because number one, we believe that actually a lot of relaxations boost our working efficiency when you're actually having that kind of switch of mindset when you're not being squeezed every day. And secondly, we think that for the most extremely poor people, hard workers, they actually don't really have time to waste. They actually need to work their ass off every day to put food on the table. So what do we have on our side of the house? Number one, we're going to tell you what the status quo looks like and what on their side of the house these things will look like. The status quo is that we think that those people who get to choose to opt into Mottainai are those people actually have time and money to waste. Meaning that a lot of these kind of waste are created by somewhat richer people, right? They actually consume goods, they can buy shit and stuff like that. On their side of the house, but for the extremely vulnerable people in the status quo is that they have no choice but to use those kind of things because they cannot afford those kind of things. They can only recycle so that they do not waste a lot of money. Meaning that these people are the ones that we actually care about, and we are going to tell you why we help them more on their side of the house. Why in their world, it looks like that everyone just reserve their own money. They don't think that these goods are actually meaningful. They just buy essential goods and stuff like that, which are in fact a lot of industries on their side of the house because we think that they will be having less desire to buy new things, people having less desire to do consumption, etc., etc. What does that look like? I'm going to do things here. Number one, why on our side of class the economy will be much better, and secondly, why on our side of class people's mentality will be changed, and why it's actually good for the most vulnerable people in the society. So we think that more consumption is actually not something bad, as they talk about they assert capitalism is bad, right? We think that the narrative is more like on their side because they don't think that buying new thing is actually justified. They think that it's a waste of time. So the people will have less desire to do that, meaning the need for new things will be much less. Meaning a lot of these kind of like new productions will be less because we think that the very key essential boost for production is your desire to buy new things. Meaning when a lot of consumers are consuming these kind of products, the companies will have more resources to get into to develop new products. People will have more resources to boost their productivity because people's desire just increase. Meaning a lot of this kind of market will be much larger on our side of the house because people have the desire to buy more new goods. People have the desire to do so, even if it go to waste in the end. We still think that these more production will countervail a lot of these kind of so-called environmental damage on their side of the house. We think that for those kind of waste, on their side of the house, it looks like, number one, people won't buy those kind of things because they think that it's a waste of time and energy, and maybe a lot of companies will not do so. And secondly, they will have stigmatizations of those people who actually consume goods because they think that, oh, you're doing something that's totally different from the mainstream mentality, you're doing something just out of your own desire, because you're greedy and stuff like that. And thirdly, people will be more likely to be content with what they have because they think that these things are essential in their life. They already have those things, so they will have less desire to look at other people's life because they will have less desire to have this kind of mood of envy and stuff like that. So what do these kind of things look like? We think on our side of the house, a lot of rich people that actually have the time and money to buy new things. We think that actually it's good for other people, for example, in developing countries, right? Because when they're actually buying some kinds of things, that means that there is a whole supply chain when they're buying one specific product, meaning a lot of these kinds of job opportunities are involved in the whole procedure. A lot of these kind of profits are going to the salary of those workers. A lot of these kind of things will happen in the like a lot of these kind of factories are built to provide more and more job positions and providing a lot of these kind of goods on table on their side of the house. Why on their side of the house? What does kind of things look like? I think on their side of the house, it looks like that. A lot of these kinds of industry will have less, things like entertainment, stuff like that. Because the thing that a lot of people just think you don't have to do a lot of these kind of things. For example, when you're in Thailand, you go diving, etc., etc. People would think that, oh, it's just a waste of time and energy, and people will have less desire to do so. A lot of this kind of third industry will even not exist on their side of the house, like manicure and restaurants. I think that is actually bad because people think that these kind of industry are just a waste of time and resources. Less job opportunities like this will occur in the world. We think, what is the comparison on their side of the house? Things look like they will have a lot of jobs in key industry. What does that look like? It looks like some essential industry, like water, like electricity, a lot of these kind of utility that people actually need to use every day. So more and more of these jobs will be created instead of other jobs that have lower threshold. Why on our side of us we get better? Because we think that a lot of these kind of third industry and other things, they do not require you to have specific knowledge, to have a specific connection, stuff like that. Because a lot of these kind of electricity and stuff like that, they usually tend to be like state-owned enterprises, then usually have to have some sort of specific knowledge. You need to get a degree to get into that specific industry. While on our side of the house, you only need to learn some specific basic skills, for example, like doing massage, so that you can actually get into those kind of things. I think that is much better because on our side of the house, we create more job opportunities for those most vulnerable people on the ground. But on their side of the house, a lot of this kind of industry require a lot of other things that you don't really have when you are actually not winning the birth lottery in the first place. So we think that on their side of the house, these kind of things will be much worse, and they will create more harms on the most vulnerable group of people. While on their side of the house, the most vulnerable people, the only way for them to make money is through, for example, things like agriculture when they're creating more food, which means that they will be less likely to have the social mobility and entrench the wealth gap on their side of the house. And secondly, within on their side of the house, when people have those kinds of a minimalism, meaning that they will be less likely, that they will be more likely to be content with their life, that they have less desire to look at other people. We admit that there are a lot of people feeling sad when they're scrolling social media content, etc., etc. But we think that these kind of stuff, that the desire is very specific for the most vulnerable people to know that they actually had to fight for the thing they want, right? For example, a lot of these kinds of social movements are driven by the fact that people are not contenting with what they want. People think that I belong to something more, I deserve something more. Maybe I cannot have this kind of big houses and those kind of luxury like the white people are. That's the reason why I want to go on street and fight for myself. That's the reason why I want more policy catering to myself. What does that look like on their side of the house? On their side of the house, a lot of these kind of things look like. People think that, oh, maybe on our side of the house, when people are dissatisfied with their life, when people have more desire to go on the street, to shout for their rights, to long for more of these kind of other things, whether it's some tangible stuff like goods, whether it's some other things like some invisible reputation stuff like that, I do think that we create more incentives for them to fight for themselves. For all those reasons, I'm really proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to invite the second app speaker here. Or that's
Just
fine,
not
yeah.
use it.
Let's just
Yeah.
not use the mic.
Yeah, the mic
It's
is
disconnected.
Starting in speech in 3, 2, 1. I love traveling. I want to go to Thailand to debate. I want to go to Jakarta next year to debate as well. But also, I'm a very wasteful person. I walk down the street, I see a random burger shop, I eat that even if I'm not hungry. That's what wastefulness is. And compound that eating that wasteful burger like for 1 year or like 2 years, how much money I could have saved for traveling. Passion is still going to exist on our side of the house. Wanting to explore, wanting to do things you love is still going to exist on our side of the house. You're still going to do it, but you're going to do it more efficiently on our side of the house because now you're more mindful. Now you know what you want in your life and you're going to have that no matter what, no matter all the distractions that you have on their side of the house. Very uncharitable characterization of what we propose in this book, right? They come up and tell you nothing's going to happen, everyone's going to shut off their spending, everyone's just going to stay on their home and not do anything. We don't defend that world. We're defending a world where people are more into what choices they are making, what pushes that choice, and how they are going to impact them in the longer life. People are more mindful and spending things more accurately, more thoughtfully, and that's what the word we're defending. What am I going to do in my speech? I'm going to first provide some extraneous rebuttal to all those uncharitable claims. I'm going to give responses to them. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why poor people or people who can't spend or waste is still a very important part of this debate. And lastly, I'm also going to extend more on environment. So firstly, in terms of arguments that came from the air, right? They say, oh no, on our side, discussions are not going to happen because you're not going to buy products. I understand that's very dumb to assume that, because if Zara is not green, if Zara is doing things like wasting a lot of water and also not being green, even after they claiming that, there's still going to be discussion about that because environmental groups still exist on our side of the house, and people, because of this dominant ideology, care about those things, right? So it's not symmetric. More buyings are not symmetric to having more discussions about corporations. That's still going to happen. I don't know why they assume that. But secondly, they come on and claim a very interesting thing that, look, you need more buy-ins for products to develop. Understand, first of all, we're talking about things like shirts, pants, things you wear, right? These are deep discussions to get improved. I don't know how more discussion on shirts are going to give you more cheaper shirts in the future. That's not something, it's not technology, it's not computers and stuff that you need more developments, you need more people buying it so that you can incrementally develop. These are static things that exist right now on our side of the house. But secondly, we're not saying that people will not buy it at any cost, people will still buy it, but the comparative is you are now going to buy one pant or one shirt, whereas on their side of the house, you're going to buy 4 shirts and then justify it by saying, okay, I have the money, I can spend it however I want, right? So that's not how it works. But lastly, they talk about passions and stuff like that. You're not going to have tourism industry, you're not going to have vacation industry, etc., etc. But what do we say in response? we tell you that look, these things are going to exist on our side of the house, because things like this are something some people crave, right? You want to do traveling, you want to visit different countries, you're still going to have that idea and you're still going to do it. But secondly, what's the comparative? The comparative is you as someone who looks at your rich friends, see that they're getting a manicure. On their side of the house, you're going to feel pressured by that ideology of other people doing it and you wanting that thing to happen in your life as well. But on our side of the house, you don't do it because you think that's unnecessary for you, right? So you can make those decisions, you can make those calls, and that's better for you. Now, understand very important stakeholder of this debate, how poor people or like how middle income people as a whole is a very important part of this. Because understand, the way people suffer is not only physically or not only because they are deprived, it's also because you have a perception of how rich live their life. And that perception is much more consolidated on this particular time is because of social media. So you have access to higher people's life, you see what they do in day-to-day life, etc. Right? So it's, as I said, it's not only physical, it's also mental, right? So you see more people buying a lot of luxury items, spending a lot of things, but then you don't have that capability because of a lot of things, right? Maybe you then blame yourself because of a birth lottery of you being born in Bangladesh, or like capitalism in general. It's very hard to break those structures and go up your corporate ladders or go up in the wealth ladder and become very rich and have those things, right? It's very impossible to do so. So what do you do on their side of the house? On their side of the house, you have no way out, but you are bombarded by those luxurious, wasteful things that rich people buy and then like throw away, but you feel bad about yourself because you can't do that, because you don't have the ability to do that. Our side of the house is the only side that provides an exclusive consolence to these people and don't let them feel bad. Because now you understand that these things are not necessary for you to live a happy life. You can still be happy with all the things that you have. You can still be content. But understand, secondly, they cannot just now come up and say that, oh, but this drive is important because now they can drive chase. No, these are not things that you require to live. So you don't need a Porsche or like a Lamborghini to have a good life. You can just have a normal car and be content with that, right? But on their side of the house, you are never going to be able to achieve that Porsche, but you are going to also feel like hopelessly sad about yourself because you can do that. Lastly, in terms of like environmental benefits, right? No response on our like huge argumentation on how you change, like firstly on policy, secondly on internal corporation mentality, and thirdly on people pushing Zara to actually change or corporations to actually change their ways, right? I'll hammer on that these more. Firstly, understand how it affects the internal corporations and corporations' behaviors. So we have people inside Zara, right? Zara is also run by normal people like us. They have the profit incentive because of this capitalism, the hyper mentality or like dominant ideologies. We want to make more profits, even if it is in the sake of the environment. But as this is the dominant ideology that we are talking about, this means more of those people who do internal policies inside those corporations, understanding this environment is a priority, not wasting is a priority. We might not like, this is something that we made, right? Zara like had those hyper-consumeristic ideology called light fashion. They brought it, they could have not brought it, and on our side of the house, that choice is made. But understand it's also important because even with policies, it's very hard to tackle corporations because that profit incentive exists internally. But only on our side of the house, we tackle that profit incentive, going to those people's minds and changing how they think and make sure that even if they're making profit sustainably. But lastly, understand what happens on their side of the house. On their side of the house, like people love Zara, right? Hyper-consumerism is the dominant mentality. Then what you do is you want Zara to just claim that, oh, I am green. And then you guys are happy because your favorite fashion brand is now green. You don't inquire whether or not they are actually green or not, whether or not they have reduced the wastage of water, whether or not they have reduced the waste of greenery, right? But on our side of the house, as this is the dominant ideology, that is to say, you are more about not wasting stuff, you actually inquire. You don't now need your favorite corporation to give a blank statement, but you need your favorite corporation to show you actual changes to keep supporting them. I have never been prouder to stand on a side that stands for the earth's betterment. Extremely proud.
second negative speaker. Here.
Okay. The time will start in
Wait.
3. Oh, okay.
Let's wait for everyone to settle.
Okay.
All right, whenever you're ready.
Okay. My time will start in 3, 2, 1 now. What's the winning metric in today's debate? We think the comparison should be which side of house will benefit the smaller rural people in our today's world. So that's based on that, I will do two direct comparisons to the affirmative side of house. So the main case from the affirmative side of house is that they think the fast fashion and consumption like Zara is actually no good. But we think that that's not necessarily bad for two responses. The first response is that we think those consumers, they have their own rational right. If they are poor, they have difficulties earning their own life, they can make their own choices, like to put food on the table and pay for the tuition for the children. And what's the delta on both sides of the house? We think that those people who have generally a lot of money and they can choose what sphere that their money should be devoted. So like Zara, if they spend money for Zara, they can get the inner happiness as they are the consumers. They can look more beautiful and look more attractive. So we think by this comparative, the consumers themselves have the rationality to choose what they want. The second response is that we think this kind of fast fashion actually provides a lot of job opportunities and productivity on our today's world. What's that look so? We think this is a line from the redistribution line. We distribute the wealth from rich people to those poor people. For example, those raw material from third world country like Thailand, they can get the money for those agricultural farmers. And secondly, the designers from those poor families working in fast fashion companies, they can also get a lot of money. The employees from the advertising companies like the social media, they can also get a job and pay their debts by this kind of whole process. So by these two kind of responses, we think people on their own position get a lot of money from the process of consumption. So what's the comparative counterfactual on our side of house? We think three counterfactual. The first counterfactual is the individual happiness. On their side of house, they think they feel very guilty for any kind of enjoyment. From the first speaker, from the affirmative side of house, they think like hard working and learning and working is the most important thing in their whole life. So they totally lose other kind of enjoyment. They lose the incentive to enjoy art, enjoy friendship, enjoy cross-cultural conversation. Because that kind of thing are considered as unnecessary on their side of house. But we think for the majority of people, the majority of happiness comes from unnecessary things. You don't want to still thinking about job and study after you go out of the classroom and go out of the company. So we think in our side of house, we provide them with an incentive and a moral high ground for everyone to enjoy their very happy life. The second comparison is that in their side of house, we think the affirmative side of house will suffer from very severe unemployment. What's the status quo? We think the status quo is the key technology are usually in hands of the developed countries. Everyone assumes that the smartphones are important, cars are important, houses are important, but that kind of very advanced technology are usually seized in the hands of those very developed countries like US, those Apple and Microsoft, those big tech giants. That are kind of technologies that we all people consider as necessary. So what is unnecessary on their side of house? On their side of house, unnecessary things like the third world industry, like the tourism in Thailand, like those souvenirs, those journeys, that diving, that kind of enjoyment, it's totally unnecessary on their side of house. What will happen? The comparative in their side of house is that people lose their sources of income. So the comparative is, in our side of house, those vulnerable people, they can still earn a lot of money by their culture, by their unique impression to those tourists. That's the comparative on both sides of house. So the third comparative is about power imbalance and social stratification. I will tell you why in their side of house, that kind of power imbalance is much more severe. Because on their side of house, we think the non-necessary consumption, like water and electricity, are usually owned by state-owned enterprises. I will call them as SOE. And what's the characteristic of SOE? Those kind of industries usually do not require a very high ability. That means the key key officials in those SOEs are usually relatives and have connections with the state officials. That means it is highly inaccessible for the poor people on the ground, even if they go to very good universities, even if they have very good they go abroad to get the diplomas from the prestigious universities. It is still very difficult for them to go to those SOEs because they do not have a very high threshold. What's the comparison in our house? We think we provide a very high market for them. They can choose to go to the fast fashion companies. They can choose to run an official account on the social media. So in our house, we provide this kind of very huge market for those poor people to change their life totally. And in our house, those people have countless choices. For example, they can do art, they can do fashion, they can do furniture to earn a lot of money from the full field to change their total life. So the third comparative also about social stratification. In their house, what's their impact? They think a lot of middle class people, they just feel sad and they do not feel sad and they just do not consume. They save every point of money in their own bank account. But the comparative in our house is that we think it's very necessary to see their desires, to face the exploitation in our today's world, to know how the capitalism is actually exploiting for those poor people. What's the comparison in our house? Because they think, my life is good enough, so I just accept my own life. I do not know anything about this world. In their world, slavery will still exist because those African Americans never see their life as comparatively much worse than the white people in the society. In their side of house, colonialism still exists because they don't consider independence as a very important thing because they think their life as a farmers, like they just live in their own remote village, is very important. What's the comparison in our side of house? Because people have the internal desire to pursue for more consumption. They have the internal desire to be respected by other people. So when they feel like the social structure is very unfair, it's very likely for them to raise all the questions, to go for the social movement, to participate in it, to state all their opinions, to participate in the election, and to voice out their own opinions. That's a comparison on both sides of house. And finally, move on to my constructive speech. Why in our side of house, we think the productivity is so important. What's the premise of this? What's the premise of this part of my speech? I think the premise is already proved by my partner. That means in our house, because people have more desire, people want to earn money. So that means there's more productivity on our whole society. Why this productivity is so important? By three mechanisms. The first mechanism is about environment, green technology. The second mechanism is about medicine. The third mechanism is about charity. Look at the first mechanism. In our house, we can better benefit environmental green technology. What's the comparison in the other house? They think, just everyone makes such big sacrifice for the environment. People do not buy it so much. So there's no problem for the environment. We don't need to invent new technology to solve the global warming, to solve the pollution caused by those factories. The counterfactual in our house is that we think people, on one side, they just consume. On the second side, they still feel guilty that putting a lot of pollution to the environment. And also, based on the fact that we already have a lot of productivity. And by combining all these products, we think in our house will have high investment into those green technology, such as recyclable products and green electrical cars. And we think in our house we will have a very high conscience for investing and inventing those green technology. The second mechanism is about medicine. The medicine is based on the level that people already have food and clothes on the table. And after that, people have the attention and the energy to care about their body and their health. In our house, because people have extra money to invest in that kind of investigation towards medicine. So we think people in Africa no longer face the difficulties like malaria because we have extra productivities to do so. The third mechanism is about charity. Because in their side of house, they don't have empathy towards other people. They never see other people's lives. The comparison in our side of house is that we have NGO, we have humanitarian aid to those third world countries who suffer a lot in those serious situations. Based on that, they're proud to oppose.
Sorry, before we proceed to the audience, if you need to leave the room, please leave after the speaker, all right? So after the speech, please also put your phones on silent. Thank you. All right, thank you for that speech. I'd like to invite the third affirmative speaker. Here.
starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Understand side negative today claims to cater to the poor and claims to cater to the developing world, where they do not give us any mechanism as to how climate change is literally taking away their lands, as to how wealthy people buying more things and investing in fast fashion is literally exacerbating the harms of climate change and exacerbating more floods, more storms that are destroying these people's lives, that are literally taking away their livelihoods. So it's extremely immoral for side negative to come up today and claim that just because, sweatshops will exist, these people will have immense social mobility and be able to move out of those places, right? So, firstly, I will give you some rebuttals to second speaker's case, and then I will talk about the clashes of this debate, right? So firstly, side negative comes up and tries to defend a very high and impossible burden, that is fast fashion is somehow good for a lot of people, right? What are the impacts that they draw? The impacts that they draw is that, yeah, there will be more cash influx, people will have more money, and that's how people will, gain up the social ladder. Firstly, understand how fast fashion works. Right? It was never made in the sense to cater to poor people, right? It is made on the literally back breaking and exploiting of these people. That means paying them less in terms of just because how unsustainable the companies are and just because how much they don't care, they simply fast fashion is an immense impossible thing to prove as something that's good, right? Understand, then they come up and talk about only rich people are going to buy from fast fashion and poor people won't, right? Two responses to this. Understand that firstly, this debate encompasses a whole lot, right? A lot of people. So suppose if I'm middle class, me being wasteful is also part of this debate, right? I might not have the ability to buy a Porsche, but I still have the ability to buy things that I don't need. That is to say, buying a very expensive graphics card that I don't need for my computer, buying a very expensive shirt that I probably don't need, right? So all of these things are to say that understand that in this sphere of fast fashion existing, what does the comparative look like for me as a middle class individual, right? For me as a middle class individual, I have more options that seem cheaper to me, and I'm influenced by hyper-consumerism to buy it, right? So this is a very important distinction in this debate to understand what does an ideology when it's dominant mean, right? So the entire case of our case is contingent upon this idea of understanding how the narrative or how the mind shifts, right? So understand when you talk about a mentality, what does capitalism ensure, right? It ensures a mentality of hyper-consumerism. That is to say, you still have all the benefits that they talk about. That is to say, you are still passionate about buying things, you still want to do things for fun, but what happens is you want to do these things because you are seeing other people doing it and you are seeing richer people doing it when you yourself might not have the capacity to do so. So the narrative shift that we're trying to give you is that this alters these people's calculus. That is to say, people will still want to have fun, right? So their entire mechanism of how suddenly just because having fun is only a necessary thing doesn't make sense, right? For you to recharge after a long day of work, for you to recharge after coming back home from a long day of college, you need to play a game, right? You need to have fun. So understand that it is more a more likely characterization that having fun, recharging, kicking back is also necessary for you as a human individual to survive, to live, right? So the entire mechanism doesn't stand in terms of how happiness is necessarily unnecessary. It doesn't make sense. So what is then the comparative to this notion, right? The comparative is understand that in our side of the world, when you're kicking back, you're relaxing, you're probably doing it what? You're playing it a game for 2 or 3 hours, you're watching a movie, you're going out and taking a spa day, right? But what you're doing is, you're probably not going to the expensive spa, the expensive spa shop right down the store, rather than going to one that's close to you, right? Or you probably go to that expensive spa shop once a month, but you don't do it multiple times because you see your posher and richer friends go to that expensive shop much more times than you do. So this is the mentality shift that happens. That is to say, the more dominant it is about not being wasteful. You still have fun, you still do all of these things, but you do it on your own decision-making calculus, and you think about your capacity because before you look towards other people, before you look towards people who probably have more capacity than you, right? Then they also talk about how this will suddenly equate to more jobs and equate to all of these things and social mobility and all of these things, right? Understand social mobility still exists in our side of the world because wanting to advance in your life is not unnecessary, right? Wanting to get out of that poor village that you are is still something that you innately will always want to do. It is not unnecessary for you to try to have a life that's better in terms of resources, better in terms of stuff. like being like content with what you have doesn't necessarily mean that you be content that you like become stagnant in your social circles, right? You still want to progress, you still want to move. So the understanding here is that wastefulness isn't like it doesn't necessitate to like the characteristics that we're talking about. Okay, so now let's talk about the clashes. So firstly, let's talk about personal satisfaction. I've already talked about this, how like want and passion still exist. You are still you are just mindful. It alters your genetic calculus, and you are just less influenced by hyperconsumerism and what other people are doing and about yourself, right? On a second layer, we've also talked about like poor people feeling guilt about this, right? About personal satisfaction. They don't talk about this at all. They do not respond very engaged to this matter. Understand that in their side of the world, because of hyperconsumerism, when this individual, it's like unlikely for someone who is born in Bangladesh to like rank up the ladder so much that they become like a CEO of like some high corporate office in America. Like it's very unlikely. Only that can happen when that person has like been blessed with like a lot of resources in their family and born with a rich family. So what do we do then here? Then understand if for some reason, which is more likely that these people will not probably rank up to these CEO positions that hyper-consumerism advertises to these people feel less bad now outside of the world because they understand that their capacity is limited to the extent that they were born with, right? There are things that are out of their hand, but in their side of the world, these people feel more and more guilty and more bad and feel shameful that they're not being able to rise up these ladders, but when they should be able to do that because hyper-consumerism and capitalism tells them to hustle and tells them to go up the tracks, right? So understand how outside of the world, poor people feel less guilt, less bad about their like current status quo and feel content about doing things, right? So the picturization is that when you don't just, get food on the table and that's it, you still, take your entire family day out or like have fun. You probably can't afford a three island tour in Thailand, but that doesn't necessitate to you being happy. Like happiness isn't tied to only luxury items in your life. Happiness can exist in small spheres and can exist in the capacity that you already have. So that's how we deal with personal satisfaction, right? Now let's talk about environment. They never engage to this. They only talk about more cash influx will equate to more environmental things, right? So understand how, in general, in the context of this debate, this argument is very important, right? Resources are finite, and in this notion's exclusivity, it's extremely important to talk about how wastefulness in general generates all of these things, right? So there are three lenses. Firstly, the individual lens, right? So you throwing away a bottle in the street probably might not mean a lot to you, but understand when these things compound, this translates into landfills of plastics that are not being recycled or reused. This translates into wasted garments that you throw in landfills that are still exacerbating all of these things. On a second layer, understand how this also means that policy changes less happening in their sort of world. Understand why climate change is still being exacerbated if all the mechanisms that they talk about still exist, right? People are careful about the climate, but because the dominant ideology is not, or the dominant mentality is not about wastefulness, people are still being wasteful and people are still foregoing their internal calculus about this, right? So understand for those reasons, we also take the environmental clash. And lastly, for societal change, we also tell you how people become more charitable, people become less wasteful in our side of the world, and the economies are better because even companies are less wasteful. And for those reasons, I believe we take this. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to invite the third negative speaker. Here.
Okay, so my time will start in 3, 2, 1. let's rehearse what the last speaker talked about. Like in their side of the house, like people tend to play just 3 or 4 hours of video games inside. They will not go to an expensive bar, or they will not go to expensive bar multiple times. So let's just judge about their characterizations. Like they never prove to us what exactly is really harm if you choose to go to expensive bar, or if you choose to go to expensive bar several times. The only harm can bring to you is that if you are actually money incapable of going to expensive bar, you will need this kind of money crisis, and it's more likely that you were not to go to expensive bar in the first place. And they never prove to you why you go to expensive bar where you buy something more, you will actually harm climate change. Actually, they're missing this kind of logic link for the whole debate, and just keep criticizing us that we are actually harming our environment, and we're never responding to their environmental cases. It's because they never prove to us why people's behavior is trying to buy more things that you like, or trying to go to this kind of expensive bar, trying to relax, trying to travel, or actually harming this climate change. So let's just move 3 things in this debate. First, I will try to rebut in their cases why all of the cases is actually not true and not important. Second of all, I will do rebuilding, see the rebuttals on us and why our case is still standing. And lastly, I will do a simple comparison. So let's just look at their cases. Their cases first about local operations, and they have this kind of premises people will buy something cheap because instead of wanting them in the first place, just see this kind of statement, wanting them in the first place. You didn't want this kind of thing currently. It may not prove that you were not wanting it later after all, right? And usually people have this kind of mechanism is that they want to buy something and they can see something is cheap, which means that on our side of the house we actually have more choices for all the consumers, right? We have more choices which is cheaper, which is better, and for those who actually want to buy something better, it can be an incentive for them to actually try to make more money, right, in the first place, and not depriving their own choices in the first place. It's actually not helping anything. And also just go through their environmental mechanism. Their environmental mechanism on the first individual people, they just give an example using bottles are actually devastating to the environment. However, I do believe that they actually try to give us the real solution of what exactly is to help environmental problems. Is actually have more green technology. For example, some more recyclable bottles. And there's also laws and restrictions telling you that how to recycle it from the law and which beams to throw which kind of garbage. So basically, this is actually not important. And second of all, their mechanism is actually about there will be more people were scrutinizing people, and there will be more competitors of the company. They will have this kind of incentives to produce more green technology. So basically, this is actually not mutually exclusive in the first place. In their side of the house, it's more likely that people have no desire to purchase this kind of stuff, and it is only by this kind of mechanism, no desire to purchase this kind of stuff, can only stop in environmental problems in their side of the house. However, this kind of scrutinizations and this kind of competitors between different groups are actually we have this kind of more is actually more important on our side. For example, because we know that everyone is actually purchasing, the market is actually very competitive, very scarce, and which means that there's much more scrutinizations in the market, scrutinizing those competitors, trying to build more green technology. And for those people who are actually for those companies, they're not doing this kind of green technology, will have this low reputation because there's a lot of choices. Consumers are more likely to go for this more cheap and more greener, because we both believe that environmental problem is scarce, and it's actually everyone's belief we want to do something that is actually good for the environment. And for those that doesn't want to do something, it's actually it's symmetrical. It doesn't need to be discussed. And second of all, let's look about their second opinions about people's normal habits and why it's better. Their only claim is that in our side of the house we're going to feel more guilty. But however, it's actually in this case that only in our side of the house we have a much more inclusive atmosphere. People's mentality is much more tolerant, and people can do things what they want. And they say that and their whole mechanism is that people do something that is deviating from efficiency, from productivity, is actually bad. However, in our side of the house, it's actually good for the economy, right? It's actually first of all good for the mentality of everyone, because you have desire, and your desire is being tolerated and being protected. And second of all, doing some massage or have more medical products on your appearance, and you can allocate your money more, and you have this kind of strong incentives to make more money. For our dear side of the house, they're actually stuck in this kind of a social mobility. Just they say that they just tell you that in their side of the house, we give you that you doesn't have this kind of capacity to buy this kind of stuff. You just admit it, it's your destiny, right? It's actually all of their narrative. However, in our side of the house, we have this kind of motivations to have this kind of incentives to make more money, and we're actually more productive and more efficient because we actually like have more massages and this kind of stuff. So this is actually a rebuttal. So let's first heard more about their rebuilding. Something they just say that in our side of the house we have this kind of like hyper consumer, and this is very toxic, and not wasting should be the first priority. However, in our side of the house, not wasting is a first priority. It's actually like symmetrical on both sides, because just what I said, like no one wants to like be against the whole universe. They just want to like live more, right? They especially for those coastal cities, they actually can fear this kind of climate change, and for those people, they're actually like being more alert to it. So basically, it's actually not. It's actually symmetrical on both sides, and they just claim that like hyper-consumer is bad. So, but first of all, they never explain to us what exactly and why is actually bad. Their only mechanism is that it will harm climate change, but missing a very crucial logic link here. And second of all, we tell you that like hyper-consumer is very unlikely to happen in the first place, right? So basically, if you have a lot of money, you also have like this kind of social connections that people around you will scrutinize you in the first place. If you have a lot of money and your parents tend to tell you how to make full use of money, and don't waste it too much. And second of all, even if you doesn't have this kind of like scrutinization, it's more likely that hyper-consumer only impact is on individual, and for individual, the only impact is your money crisis. And this money crisis can be much more penetrating in cultivating your own behavior. So our side of the house, like hyper-consumer is like easier and have better ways to like solve this kind of stuff. So lastly, let's do a simple comparison. So they're actually on their side of the house. Our first clash is actually on social mobility. Let's hear about their responses. Their only response I hear is one, like people initially want to get out of their island, and second of all, they're in their side of the house. They will say that it doesn't have this capacity. It's okay. You will feel less guilty. So basically, it's more like it's during the slavery and people born with slaves. It's more like in their side of telling you that slave is okay. You just don't have this capacity, and they even deprive of their own desire to fight back this kind of exploitations in their side. However, it never responds to us that like why this kind of job opportunity is very important, because we know that like there's only things the only status quo in this debate is that the richer people are being controlled by, because the poor people, they're actually forced to follow this kind of mentality in the first place, and richer people can control, meaning that there's a lot of like third industry, travel, a souvenir, medicine, and this kind of life quality thing, and it's something that improves life quality is unnecessary in their first place. This kind of third industry actually they're being deprived, and also the many jobs, the only industry standing in their side is like water, electricity, this kind of state-owned enterprises, which is actually bad for social mobility in the first place. And second of all is that like developing countries are going to be doomed, because like developed countries, they don't like consume this kind of stuff in the developing countries. And so lastly, very important is that like the poor people, they will never have this kind of urge to fight for exploitations in the first place. And for the above reasons, proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to invite the last speaker of the negative side, Girolamo, please. Here.
Our stance is pretty clear here. When a rich guy or even a so-called middle-class guy wastes a bunch of money on on manicures, massage, or buying Zara clothes, we're fine with that, even if it's not what they really want. Because when they lose their money, we really don't care about it. Because those money are going to trickle down to go to the most vulnerable people in the society who don't even have the capacity to waste at all, because we think that those are the most vulnerable group of people that we care about. On their side of the house, a lot of this money will stay in the rich hands, and even if the middle class somehow gets hurt on their side of the house, we don't think that is the necessary harms that they are actually having the greatest impact on, and we think that these kind of money can actually can actually be the money for those most vulnerable people who cannot afford the meal in the very first place. So their case is kind of mandatory, but they tell us that people's passion is enough to generate those booming industry like we talked about. They have to defend why on their side of the house. They have the same amount of consumption and production that we already told you about. They tell us that, service industry still exists because people have passion about it. We told you that, number one, they will have less money flowing in. Maybe that it means that these kind of industries at least will be smaller in size, right? And secondly, we already told you from our first speech that why this kind of narrative and those kind of mentality will have stigmatizations on those people who actually spend money on it, even if it is according to their own willingness and stuff like that, because the other people would think that it's a waste of time and energy, etc., etc. Finally, within on their side of the house, they will have less advertisement and stuff like that, meaning the popularity would not be that large, and even if they do have that kind of passion for them, it's still hard for them to actually really know about it and unlock about it and also have this kind of attraction in the very first place. And secondly, it tells us that people opt into a minimalist lifestyle, and which is something good. They're really kind of being idealistic here, because firstly, we have already told you how this kind of social narrative will work and why this kind of mainstream ideology will have this kind of dominating impacts on people, because different people have different idea what's wasting, right? For example, when your parents told you that you shouldn't waste money on buying bottled water, you should just use the tap water, we think that these kind of things will have an extremely bad impact on people around the world, because people do not really follow their heart on their side of house. They have to defend why people actually have the capacity to do that if other people with the same mentality actually regard it as the same type of waste they call about. And we think that these kind of stigmatizations will create more harm on people's mentality. And second of all, even if on their side of house they think that, oh, the middle class people are going to get hurt, we have already told you about people at least, we actually help those people who at least have the capacity to waste, because we think that those people who actually can afford that, they don't really have to suffer from this kind of existential crisis. So what do we prove on our side of house? Number one, we tell you on our side of house, we have a larger scale of consumption drives the productivity increase, meaning that a lot of this kind of capital and these corporations will be larger and maybe create more jobs, especially in the third industry. And also we tell you how this kind of third industry actually have a lower threshold. It means that it actually create jobs which the poor people can actually have access to. Number one, we think that it at least guarantees some income for them to do, and it's larger than what they have when they're being farmer, when they're doing things like providing essential goods, etc., etc. Secondly, we think that at least you have the initial accumulation of capital, meaning that you unlock more and more resources, and we think that these kind of impacts will be expanded to when you are unlocking more education resources for descendants, etc., etc. Meaning that these kind of things may not make you a congressman like we talk about in the future, but at least you have the very capital that you actually need to guarantee like your basic life standards, etc., etc. And secondly, we think that the comparative on their side of house is like a lot of these kind of like an industry that actually get more money flowing in are like the essential industry, right? Those like when you are using those kinds of utility, etc., etc. Meaning that you have to actually get the higher degree of like education and stuff like that in order to get into that kind of industry, especially when a lot of these kind of things are owned by the states. Meaning that a lot of these kind of things which will be much more inaccessible for the most vulnerable people on the ground. We help the most vulnerable people in the society. That's the reason why we actually take this debate. For all those reasons, proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to invite the last speaker for this round. Affirmative applies to you. Please stand here.
Wastefulness is the only way to utopia, only way to better the world, only way to make people live. That's the side, but that's the stance that Team Neg tries to take. What do we do in this way? We tell you that look, wastefulness is something that's in the definition, that you waste it, you don't need it, it's not necessary, it's not good for the environment, for the world, for the society. We say that all the exclusive benefits that you bring already exist on our side of the house, but what harms you bring doesn't exist when you change them. What are the things I'm going to do in my speech? Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about from individual lenses how people's choices are affected and how we win that clash. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how on like broader scale how we like improve like cash flow and other sustainable businesses. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about environmental impacts which had no response from negative. So firstly, understand in terms of choices, right? So we say that choice is like the choice that they try to claim for is like Zara having 120 stores over like the whole country and having like multitudes of options for you to choose from. We say that that is an unnecessary choice. You can still be okay living your life without like one or two allotments less on our side of the house. So that means it's not a necessary choice and they haven't been able to prove it so. But what do you get on our side of the house? You get less amount of landfills, you get more of these monies going to environmental sustenance, etc. right? But secondly, also, they say on our side of the house, small businesses are never going to exist. Understand that we talk to you about the framing of happiness, right? You being able to distinguish what you find happiness in and what you waste in, right? So for rich people, not having a massage or like having a massage doesn't like really matter that much, because like for them, the wastefulness is about whether or not you are going to buy the next Lamborghini, whether like even if you have one, right? So all of these things like are like when connected back to happiness still exist. But ultimately, the most vulnerable group of this debate, the middle class people, right? Those people who see those social media posts, feel bad about themselves. They have no mechanism to tackle their feeling bad about themselves, right? So for all of those reasons, we win the clash in terms of choice. But lastly, they came out and like also claim a very weird thing, that on our side of the house, social mobility is not going to exist, and then they claim very extreme claims, right? They say that racism, colonialism is still going to exist on our side of the house. I mean, how like stupid of a claim that is, that you say that people getting beaten up, people getting enslaved, chained literally, and they won't do anything about themselves. I don't think that's a fair characterization to credit them on. But lastly, in terms of environmental characteristics, right? What do we say on our speeches? We give you like literally 3 mechanisms on to how you change consumer behavior, but while not reducing profits and like other buying stuff, etc. Right? You're still going to sell clothes. Zara is still going to be a big company and make profits. People are still going to buy clothes, right? But now they're going to buy more sustainable clothes, like, right? They're like probably going to spend the same amount of money, but won't be throwing away all of those money to the landfills, right? But also we talk to you about how we internalize like corporate changes, right? How those changes actually like impact the water wastages of Zara, actually impact them not cutting down more trees for their own corporations' benefits, them prioritizing the environment. And this debate was about dominant ideology, right? So this debate was about how people perceive this dominant ideology, not people feeling bad because they can spend more, because this is not the dominant ideology anymore. I'm so proud I defended this case today. I'm so proud.
Alright, thank you debaters for that round. You may cross the floor and shake hands, and congrats.